The morning sun spread a soft light across the city streets as Marcus stepped outside his apartment. His uniform was freshly ironed, his tie neatly knotted, and his backpack felt heavier than usual, though not because of the books inside. At 12 years old, he carried more than just notebooks and pencils on his shoulders. He carried the hopes of his parents, the dreams he whispered to himself late at night, and the lessons his father had taught him about discipline, strength, and dignity. His father was not an ordinary man. He was a Navy SEAL commander, a figure of quiet authority whose presence could silence a room. But to Marcus, he was simply Dad, the man who tied his shoelaces when he was younger and who reminded him every night that no matter how unfair the world seemed, he must never forget who he was. That morning, Marcus walked with the determination of a boy who wanted to make his family proud. He thought about the math test waiting for him, and the way his teacher always smiled when he got answers right. He thought about the science project he had stayed up late to finish, his desk lamp glowing while the rest of the house was silent. He thought about how his mother kissed his forehead before leaving for work and told him to walk carefully. There was no reason for him to expect anything unusual that day. It was just another school morning, or so he believed. The city was alive with sound, car horns, footsteps, distant conversations, but Marcus kept his eyes forward. He walked with steady steps, his small figure moving among taller adults who barely noticed him. He liked the feeling of independence even though he was still young. Walking to school gave him time to think, to imagine, to rehearse the answers to his test questions. His tie swung gently against his shirt as the breeze brushed by. His polished shoes clicked softly against the sidewalk. Yet beneath that calm routine, Marcus was always aware of the world around him. His father had taught him to be observant, to notice details others might ignore. He remembered one of his father's lessons. Son, strength is not only in muscles, it is in the way you see the world. Watch carefully. Pay attention. It will protect you. So Marcus noticed the man sitting on the bench reading a newspaper, the woman pushing a stroller, the delivery truck parked slightly too close to the corner. He noticed the patrol car slowly turning onto the street behind him, though at first he thought nothing of it. His school was only a few blocks away, but the walk always felt like a small journey. He passed familiar buildings, an old bakery that smelled of fresh bread, a corner store with faded posters, a tall office building with mirrored windows that reflected the busy street. Each step was routine, yet each step carried him closer to an unseen test. Not the one written on paper with math problems, but one that would test his patience, his dignity, and his courage. Marcus adjusted the straps of his backpack and breathed deeply. He thought again about his father. Commander Carter was away often, serving his country in places Marcus could barely picture. Sometimes weeks passed before he saw him, but every moment together was precious. His father's voice was steady, filled with wisdom. Marcus, there will be days when people will not see you for who you are. They might see only what they expect, but never let their vision become your truth. You know who you are. Hold on to that. Those words stayed with Marcus every single day. As he walked past the main square, the sound of the patrol car grew louder. He glanced sideways and saw it slowing down. The officers inside were looking in his direction. His stomach tightened, though he told himself not to overthink it. He was just a boy walking to school, nothing more, but the way the car stopped made him uneasy. The doors opened and heavy boots landed on the pavement. Marcus's heart began to beat faster. Though he forced himself to keep his pace steady, he remembered another lesson. Fear is natural, son, but courage is how you walk forward even when fear whispers in your ear. For a brief moment, he wished his father were beside him. He wished he could hear his calm voice guiding him, but he knew he had to walk this path alone, at least for now. He reminded himself that he had done nothing wrong. He was not breaking any rules. He was simply on his way to school. Yet the presence of the officers following behind made his steps heavier. The city seemed to grow quieter around him. The usual chatter and car horns faded in his mind as he focused on the sound of his own heartbeat. He held his head a little higher, trying to appear calm. People walked past him, not noticing the tension building in the air. To them, he was just another boy in a uniform. To him, every second felt like a test of strength. He thought of his father again, remembering the stories he told of training. Grueling days under the sun, long nights of cold and exhaustion, tests designed to break even the strongest men. His father endured it all because he believed in discipline, honor, and resilience. Marcus wondered if this was his own kind of training, not with weights or weapons, but with patience and quiet strength. His small hands gripped the straps of his backpack tightly. He rehearsed in his mind what he might say if spoken to, how he would answer with respect, how he would keep his voice steady. He wanted to do everything right, to show that he was not afraid, to show that he had been raised with discipline. He reminded himself of the values his father lived by: integrity, courage, and respect. The walk, which usually felt short, stretched endlessly that morning. Each step carried the weight of uncertainty. Marcus's eyes shifted from the pavement to the tall buildings around him, then back to the patrol car creeping closer. He wondered if others noticed, if anyone else could sense the tension in the air. Yet most people seemed busy, focused on their own lives. Only Marcus felt the invisible storm building around him. He pressed on, telling himself silently, "I am Marcus Carter. I am strong. I am going to school. That is all." The words were simple, but they gave him strength. He could almost hear his father's voice repeating them with him, guiding him forward. When he finally reached the corner near the main square, the car stopped completely. Marcus's steps slowed, his chest rising and falling more quickly. He knew that something was about to happen. The test he had been preparing for unknowingly was about to begin. He inhaled deeply, straightened his tie, and prepared himself. What Marcus did not know was that his walk that morning would soon be remembered not only by him, but by everyone who witnessed it. It would become more than just a walk to school. It would become a moment of truth, a story of quiet strength, and the beginning of a lesson that even those in power needed to learn. And as he stood there, waiting for what came next, he thought once more of his father's words, words that seemed to echo louder than the noise of the city. "Son, no matter where you are, no matter what happens, never forget, you are strong, you are worthy, and you are my son." Marcus had always been told by his father that the world could sometimes be unfair, but nothing could prepare him for the way that morning unfolded. After leaving his small apartment, he walked with his backpack strapped tightly to his shoulders, his school tie perfectly knotted, his shoes polished to a shine. He looked like any other boy his age who cared about school and wanted to make his parents proud. The city streets bustled with people, cars, and buses, but Marcus kept his eyes ahead. He had a math test that day, and his mind was full of numbers, not of anything else. But the silence of his ordinary morning was about to be broken by voices that carried power, authority, and a sharpness that could cut through confidence. As he turned the corner near the main square, a police patrol car slowed beside him. The officers inside exchanged glances, and within moments they stepped out, their boots heavy on the pavement. Marcus's heart skipped a beat when he realized they were looking at him and only him. He had not done anything wrong, but he remembered the lessons his father repeated at home. Always stay calm, always be respectful, and never let fear show on your face. "Hey, you," one of the officers said, his voice firm but already holding suspicion. "Where are you going?" Marcus swallowed hard. "I'm going to school, sir," he replied, his voice steady, though his palms had begun to sweat. The officer's eyes narrowed. "School, huh? And what's in the bag?" "My books, sir. Just school books." Another officer stepped closer, towering over him. "You seem nervous. Why are you walking around here? This is not the direction most school kids take." Marcus felt his chest tighten. It was true. He lived a little further from the main school bus route, so he often walked the longer way. But explaining that to people who already believed something different felt almost impossible. He tightened his grip on the straps of his bag. "I live a few blocks from here. My school is on the other side. I walk this way every day," Marcus explained politely. But his words did not seem to reach them. Instead, more questions followed, faster and sharper, like stones thrown one after another. "What's your name? Why are you dressed like this? Are you carrying anything you should not have?" People on the street began to notice. A small crowd formed, watching a boy in uniform surrounded by officers in blue. Some passers-by frowned with concern while others whispered, shaking their heads. Marcus felt his face grow hot. He was not a troublemaker. He was a student. But here he was, standing in the middle of the sidewalk as though he had something to hide. The officer's tone grew harsher. "Don't play smart with us. Answer quickly." Marcus answered again and again, repeating himself, trying to keep his voice level. He remembered his father's advice. Never raise your voice, never talk back, but never let anyone crush your dignity either. That balance was hard to maintain when fear was pressing down on his shoulders. Then it happened, the moment that cut deeper than all the rest. One of the officers leaned close, his face stern, and snapped, "Black kid, shut up." The words echoed in Marcus's ears. He froze, his breath caught in his chest. He had heard stories, he had seen news reports, but hearing it said directly to him felt like the ground had dropped away. The crowd reacted too, some gasped, others muttered angrily. But Marcus stayed still, his eyes wide. In that moment, a storm raged inside him. Part of him wanted to shout back, to cry out that he was just a boy on his way to school, that he deserved the same respect as anyone else. But another part of him, the part trained by years of his father's calm guidance, told him to hold on. His father had always said, "Son, silence can be louder than shouting when you know your worth. You do not have to match anger with anger. Just stand tall." Marcus lifted his chin ever so slightly. He did not answer. He did not give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. The officer looked at him, perhaps expecting tears or an argument, but all he saw was a boy with quiet strength in his eyes. The crowd began to grow restless. Phones appeared in people's hands as they started recording. The officers shifted uncomfortably, but they still stood firm around Marcus. For him, every second stretched like an hour. He wished his father were there, not only because he longed for his presence, but because his father would know exactly how to handle this moment. Then Marcus thought of something his father once told him. "The world will test you, son. Sometimes the test is not in your books, but in how you respond to the world when it doubts you. Remember who you are. Remember whose son you are." Those words kept him steady. He stood quietly, breathing deeply, and when asked the same questions again, he answered with the same calm voice. No anger, no panic, just truth. The officers, however, did not back down. They seemed caught between their authority and the watchful eyes of the crowd. Marcus could feel the tension rising, like a rope pulled too tight. He sensed that something had to give. A woman in the crowd finally spoke up. "He's just a kid." "Leave him alone." Her voice cracked through the silence, and murmurs of agreement followed. The officers glanced around, realizing that more eyes were on them now than they expected. But still, Marcus remained the center of their focus. He clutched the straps of his bag tighter, his knuckles white, his legs trembling slightly, though he refused to show it. He thought of his mother's warm smile that morning, the way she told him to eat his breakfast quickly so he would not be late. He thought of the math test waiting for him, the pencils sharpened in his bag. This was supposed to be an ordinary day, but it was becoming a lesson he would never forget. As the confrontation stretched on, Marcus's courage grew. He realized that though he was just one boy, he had power. His power was in not letting their words define him. His power was in standing firm, showing the crowd and himself that dignity was not something anyone could take away. Minutes later, footsteps echoed from down the street, heavier and more determined than the rest. Marcus did not turn immediately, but the sound felt familiar, strong, rhythmic, and confident, the kind of stride that came from years of discipline and training. His heart leapt before he even saw him. It was his father. Commander James Carter, in his military fatigues, eyes locked on the scene, was moving swiftly toward his son. His expression was unreadable, but his presence alone shifted the energy of the street. People began to whisper, sensing that something important was about to happen. The officers had not yet noticed him, but Marcus knew. Relief washed over him, but so did pride. His father was coming, and with him came truth, protection, and a strength no one could challenge. Marcus stood a little taller, still silent, still composed, but now with the comfort of knowing that the man who had taught him resilience was only steps away. The confrontation was not over, but it was about to change in ways the officers could never imagine. The moment stretched like a string pulled too tight. Marcus stood surrounded, his small frame in the middle of uniforms, radios, and authority. He had already answered their questions with as much patience as he could gather, repeating himself until the words felt heavy in his mouth. He told them he was on his way to school, that his bag was filled with books, that he lived nearby. Still, the officers pressed on, their voices sharp, their suspicion unshaken. He felt the eyes of strangers on him, a growing circle of passers-by who had slowed their steps to see what was happening. He was 12, and yet the weight of that moment made him feel as though he carried years of responsibility on his shoulders. The officers exchanged glances as if deciding what more they could say or do. Marcus's throat felt dry, but he kept his back straight, his tie tight, his words calm. That was when it happened. One officer, taller than the rest, leaned closer, his voice low but cutting enough to slice through the air. "Black kid, shut up." Marcus's breath caught. The words landed heavy, not just on his ears but on his heart. The crowd gasped, a murmur spreading like ripples in water. Some shook their heads, others raised their phones higher to capture the moment. But for Marcus, everything around him blurred. The sound of the city faded, the crowd disappeared, and all that remained were those words echoing in his mind. He felt his chest tighten as if the air itself had turned heavy. His first instinct was to speak, to defend himself, to tell them again that he had done nothing wrong. But then he remembered his father's teachings, lessons repeated at the dinner table, whispered during bedtime talks, carved into his memory like stone. "Son, the world may try to silence you, but strength is not always in shouting back. Sometimes it is in the way you stand tall when they expect you to bow." So Marcus did not shout. He did not argue. He simply lifted his chin a fraction higher, meeting the officer's eyes with a calmness he did not fully feel but knew he had to show. Inside, his emotions churned, hurt, confusion, frustration. But on the outside, he stood with quiet dignity. That silence, that refusal to shrink, spoke louder than any words could have. The officer's expression shifted just slightly, as though he had not expected the boy to withstand the sting of his insult. Perhaps he had expected tears or fear or trembling. But Marcus gave him none of that. He gave him strength. The crowd, however, could not stay silent. A woman's voice rang out from the edge of the circle. "He's just a child. Why are you talking to him like that?" Her words were fierce, trembling with emotion. Others joined in, murmurs of disapproval, calls for fairness. Phones stayed raised, recording every second. Marcus heard them, but he did not move. His father's voice lived inside him, louder than the crowd. "Respect yourself first, and others will see your worth, even if they pretend not to at first." That memory kept him grounded. He thought of the times his father had knelt to his level, placing a firm hand on his shoulder, telling him that his strength was not in how hard he could fight, but in how steady he could stand. His small hands gripped the straps of his backpack tighter. He could feel his heartbeat in his fingertips, fast and loud, but he did not let it show. He knew people were watching, and more importantly, he knew he was watching himself. He wanted to walk away from this moment knowing he had not let anyone steal his dignity. The officers continued their questions, but their tone had shifted. Perhaps it was the crowd, or perhaps it was the boy's unbroken posture, but their voices carried less certainty now. Still, the tall officer's words lingered in the air, a shadow that no one could ignore. Marcus knew this moment would stay with him forever, etched into his memory, but he also knew he could decide how it would define him. He could let it break him, or he could let it shape him into something stronger. He chose strength. He thought of his father, far away but never absent in spirit. His father had faced battles Marcus could not imagine. Nights in the desert, missions that tested every ounce of endurance, choices that weighed heavy on a soldier's heart. Yet his father always told him that the hardest battles were not fought with weapons but with character. "Marcus," he once said, "true courage is doing the right thing even when it feels impossible. True honor is carrying yourself with respect, even when others try to strip it from you." Marcus stood in the middle of that circle, surrounded by authority, watched by strangers, and he carried himself with that very honor. His silence was not weakness. His silence was strength. Minutes felt like hours. The officers shifted, uncomfortable with the growing tension. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and a man's voice from the back shouted, "Let the boy go! He's done nothing wrong." Others echoed the sentiment, their voices adding pressure to the scene. The tall officer looked around, realizing perhaps for the first time that the power of the badge could not outweigh the power of truth, witnessed by many eyes. His jaw tightened, his hand brushing the edge of his belt, but he said nothing more. The insult still hung in the air, but it had lost its bite against the boy's unshaken stance. Marcus breathed slowly, deliberately, reminding himself of who he was. He was not just any child on the street. He was the son of a man who had led teams into danger, who had defended his country, who had shown him by example what it meant to live with courage and discipline. He was Marcus Carter, and no words, however harsh, could erase that truth. And then, in the distance, he heard it. The sound of footsteps. Strong, steady, commanding. the kind of steps that made people turn their heads. Marcus recognized it before he even saw him. His father's stride was unlike any other. Years of training, years of leadership, years of discipline, all carried in the way he walked. Commander James Carter was approaching, his eyes locked on the scene, his presence magnetic. The crowd noticed first, murmurs spreading quickly as the tall figure in military fatigues came closer. The officers had not yet turned, still focused on Marcus, but the boy's heart leapt. Relief washed over him, mixed with pride. His father was here. Marcus did not smile, but his eyes softened. He felt stronger knowing that the man who taught him to stand tall was now within reach. The harsh words still echoed, but they no longer held power. Soon everything would change. The tension in the street was thick enough to be felt in every breath. Marcus stood at the center of it, a boy in a neat uniform with a backpack heavy on his shoulders, surrounded by officers who questioned and doubted him. The crowd around them had grown, voices whispering, phones raised, expressions shifting from curiosity to disapproval. The tall officer's harsh words still lingered like smoke in the air, heavy and bitter. Marcus had not replied, had not lowered his eyes, had not let his dignity be taken. He stood still, but inside his chest his heart was pounding fast, and then the sound that changed everything came. Footsteps, firm, steady, purposeful, echoed from the far end of the street. They were not hurried, not careless. They were the kind of steps that belonged to someone who never needed to rush to be noticed. The crowd began to turn their heads, eyes widening as they caught sight of the man approaching. His frame was tall and broad, his shoulders squared, his uniform carrying the marks of service and discipline. Commander James Carter was walking toward the scene. For the bystanders, he was an imposing figure, a man whose presence commanded respect without him speaking a single word. For Marcus, he was more than that. He was Dad. The sight of him filled Marcus with a rush of relief so powerful, it almost made his knees weak. He had stood strong for as long as he could, but now the weight of the morning seemed lighter. His father was here, and with him came a sense of safety, a sense of truth, a reminder that Marcus was never alone in this world. Commander Carter's eyes locked immediately on his son, then on the circle of officers around him. He did not need to ask questions to understand. He had been trained to read situations in seconds, to assess danger, to sense the tone of a room before a single word was spoken. What he saw was not an armed enemy or a foreign battlefield. What he saw was his 12-year-old boy standing straight, clutching his backpack straps, holding back fear while surrounded by men who should have protected him, but instead treated him with suspicion. The commander's pace did not quicken, but his presence seemed to grow heavier with every step. People in the crowd stepped back slightly, giving him room, their murmurs growing louder. Phones tilted toward him now, capturing the moment as if they understood something significant was about to unfold. The officers had not yet noticed, still caught in their questions, but soon they too would feel the shift in the air. Marcus's eyes met his father's for just a second. It was a brief exchange, but it was enough. No words passed between them. But the boy saw everything he needed in that look: strength, pride, and reassurance. His father's eyes told him, "You did well, son. You stood tall. I am here now." Marcus's lips tightened, his chin lifting just slightly higher, not because he wanted to defy the officers, but because he wanted to match the courage he saw in his father. Commander Carter reached the edge of the circle, and for the first time his voice entered the scene. It was not loud, but it carried like thunder. "Is there a reason you are surrounding my son?" The officers turned, startled. Their eyes landed on the man before them, and confusion flickered across their faces. They had not expected someone of his bearing, his authority, his calm but commanding presence. One officer cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. "Sir, we were just asking some questions. The boy looked suspicious walking alone with a bag in this area." The commander's gaze did not waver. His voice remained calm, but it carried a weight that silenced even the murmurs of the crowd. "Suspicious? He is 12. He is wearing a school uniform. His bag holds books. Does this look suspicious? To you? Or is it simply easier to see suspicion where none exists?" The officers shifted uneasily. The tall one, the same who had spoken the harsh words, opened his mouth as if to argue, but the commander's eyes fixed on him, and the words died in his throat. Years of leading men in dangerous missions had given Carter a stare that could break through arrogance like glass. It was not anger in his eyes. It was authority, the kind that came from experience, sacrifice, and truth. The crowd leaned in, sensing that something powerful was happening. The energy of the street had changed. This was no longer about a boy walking to school. It was about dignity, about justice, about the weight of respect that should never have been denied in the first place. Marcus stood silently, still clutching his straps, but his body relaxed slightly. He knew his father did not need to raise his voice or make threats. His father's strength was in his calm, in the certainty of his words, in the way he carried himself. That was the lesson Marcus had been taught his whole life, and now he saw it alive in front of him. Commander Carter stepped closer, his tall figure now standing right beside his son. He placed a hand gently on Marcus's shoulder, not only as reassurance but as a statement. The message was clear. This boy is mine. He is under my protection. He deserves respect. He turned back to the officers, his tone unshaken. I am Commander James Carter, United States Navy SEAL. I have led missions on foreign soil. I have carried men home. I have worn this uniform for my country. And yet here I stand, watching my own son treated like a suspect for walking to school. Do you understand the weight of what you have done? The silence that followed was heavy. The officers shifted again, their authority shrinking under the gravity of his words. The crowd erupted in whispers, phones recording every syllable. Some people nodded, others muttered, but all eyes were fixed on the man who had turned a simple question into a mirror, forcing the officers to see themselves clearly. Marcus looked up at his father, pride swelling in his chest. He knew this was not only about him anymore. This was about every boy who had ever felt small under the gaze of authority. Every child who had been doubted for nothing more than how they looked. His father's presence turned his personal pain into a lesson for everyone present. The officers had no answer. Their silence spoke louder than any excuse could. And in that silence, Commander Carter tightened his hand on Marcus's shoulder and spoke one final time, his words carrying across the square. Respect is not a gift you hand out when convenient. It is a duty owed to every citizen, especially a child. Today, you forgot that. Do not forget it again. The crowd erupted then, not with cheers but with a low wave of approval, murmurs of agreement. The kind of sound that grows when truth is spoken and everyone feels it. Marcus stood tall, no longer weighed down by fear. He had endured the questions, the harsh words, and now he stood beside his father, shielded not only by his presence, but by the truth he carried. The father had arrived, and with him, the lesson had begun. The square was silent, heavy with the weight of what had just been said. Commander James Carter's words lingered in the air like the steady echo of a drumbeat. Marcus stood close to his father, his small figure framed by the broad shoulders of the man who had spent a lifetime serving his country. To the crowd, it looked like a scene out of a film. A boy wronged, a father stepping in with the kind of calm authority that could not be denied. But to Marcus, it was simply the moment when his father became his shield, not through force or anger, but through truth. The officers shifted uncomfortably. They had expected a quiet boy they could intimidate, a routine stop that would go unnoticed. Instead, they now faced a decorated Navy SEAL commander whose voice carried both lived experience and the weight of sacrifice. It was not just the rank he carried that silenced them, but the conviction in his words. His voice did not rise, but every syllable demanded respect. One officer finally cleared his throat, trying to recover the ground that had slipped away. Sir, we had no idea who you were. If we had known... Commander Carter cut him off, not with anger but with precision. That is exactly the problem. Respect should not depend on knowing who someone is. My son does not need a title to be treated with dignity. He is 12 years old. That should have been enough. The crowd murmured louder now. The words resonated with them. striking a chord deeper than the moment itself. Strangers nodded in agreement, some whispering to one another, some holding their phones tighter as if determined to make sure this moment reached beyond the square. Marcus felt a swell of pride in his chest. He had stood as firmly as he could when the harsh words were thrown at him, but now he watched his father transform the situation. His father was not defending only him. He was speaking for every child who had ever been doubted, for every family that had ever felt the sting of unfair treatment. It was not just about one boy on his way to school. It was about a lesson that could not be ignored. The tall officer, the one whose insult still hung in the air, shifted his weight and tried to meet the commander's eyes. "Sir, maybe this is a misunderstanding." But Commander Carter's gaze stopped him in his tracks. He did not need to shout. His presence alone was enough to silence excuses. He spoke slowly, carefully, each word carrying more than sound. A misunderstanding is when you hear wrong directions or confuse a street name. This was not that. This was judgment made in an instant, without reason, without fairness. And it was made against a child. Own what it was. The officer's lips pressed together. No defense came. The silence spoke louder than any denial could. Marcus looked at the crowd, noticing how their expressions had shifted. When the officers had first surrounded him, many people had watched with curiosity, perhaps even doubt, unsure of what to believe. But now, with his father's words cutting through the air, their faces showed something else: recognition, agreement, and a quiet kind of respect for the boy and his father standing together. A man in the crowd finally spoke up. "He's right. That boy did nothing wrong." Others joined in. "It's true. This isn't how you treat a kid." The voices grew, not angry but firm, like a wave of support rising from every side. Commander Carter glanced briefly at the crowd, then returned his gaze to the officers. "You wear that uniform to protect, not to intimidate. You serve the public, not yourself. I have worn this uniform," he said, pointing to his own fatigues, "in places where lives depended on it. I know what it means to carry responsibility. Do not forget yours." The weight of his words fell heavy, not only on the officers but on everyone listening. It was not just a reprimand, it was a revelation. A reminder that authority is not about power but about service. That respect is not optional but essential. Marcus, though still young, understood more in that moment than he ever had before. He realized that his father's strength did not come only from his military training or his rank. It came from his integrity, from his ability to turn even a painful situation into a lesson, and Marcus felt something shift inside himself. He knew that this day, however frightening it had begun, would become a part of him forever. The tall officer finally looked down, his silence an admission. The others avoided eye contact, their rigid posture softening as the truth settled in. The commander did not press further. He had said what needed to be said. The rest was for them to carry. The crowd began to applaud softly, not in the way they would at a performance, but in the way people show gratitude when someone speaks truth that needed to be spoken. It was hesitant at first, then stronger, until the sound filled the square. Marcus's chest swelled, not with arrogance but with relief. The harsh words that had pierced him earlier now felt distant, washed away by the tide of truth and dignity his father had brought with him. Commander Carter placed his hand more firmly on Marcus's shoulder, guiding him gently but firmly away from the circle of officers. The message was clear. The conversation was over. The lesson had been delivered. As they began to walk, Marcus kept his head high, not out of defiance but out of pride. He had stood through the hardest part, and now he walked beside the man who had turned the entire moment into something greater. The crowd parted to give them space, some patting Marcus on the shoulder as he passed, others nodding respectfully to the commander. One woman leaned down slightly as Marcus walked by and whispered, "You're brave." Marcus did not reply, but her words stayed with him. He had not felt brave. He had felt scared, alone, and cornered. But now, with his father beside him, he realized that bravery was not the absence of fear. It was standing tall even when fear was all around you. The officers remained behind, silent and still, their authority shaken, their actions revealed for what they were. They would remember this moment just as Marcus and the crowd would. As father and son walked side by side, Marcus looked up at his father. "Dad," he said softly, his voice trembling just slightly, "did I do okay?" Commander Carter glanced down at him, his expression softening. "You did more than okay, son. You stood tall. You remembered who you are. That's all I could ever ask of you. Marcus nodded, his throat tight, his eyes burning, though he held back the tears. His father's words were more powerful than any applause, more healing than any defense. They were the confirmation that he had done exactly what his father had taught him to do, stand with dignity, even when the world tried to strip it away. The square returned slowly to its normal rhythm. Cars moved again. Conversations picked up, the crowd dispersed. But for Marcus, the world would never feel quite the same. He had walked into the morning as just a boy worried about a math test. He was walking away now as someone who had faced unfairness, endured harsh words, and discovered his own strength. And for everyone who had witnessed it, the scene left behind a message that could not be forgotten. Respect must never depend on status. Authority must never forget its duty, and dignity must never be denied to anyone, not even the smallest schoolboy on his way to class. The square had begun to thin out, but the moment still clung to the air like a shadow that refused to leave. People walked away whispering about what they had just witnessed, their faces carrying expressions of thoughtfulness, some even of shame. Phones buzzed as clips of the encounter made their way to the digital world. Strangers who had seen it with their own eyes knew they had been part of something larger than a routine confrontation. They had watched a father reclaim his son's dignity in the most powerful way possible, through calm authority and undeniable truth. Commander James Carter and his son Marcus walked together, the father's hand resting firmly on the boy's shoulder. To the outside world it was a simple gesture, but to Marcus it was an anchor. Every ounce of fear and confusion he had carried only moments ago began to dissolve under the weight of his father's steady presence. For the first time that morning, Marcus felt like he could breathe without the tightness in his chest. He looked up at his father and saw not just the uniform of a Navy SEAL commander, but the man who had raised him to believe in his own worth. But they had not yet left the square when the sound of hurried footsteps behind them broke the silence. The officers were following. The tall one, the same who had spoken the cruel words, called out, "Commander Carter, wait." His voice was lower now, stripped of the arrogance it had carried before, but it still held a nervous edge. The commander stopped and turned slowly, his eyes steady, his expression unreadable. Marcus stopped too, standing firmly beside his father. The officers approached with hesitation, their earlier confidence drained by the weight of the crowd's judgment and the commander's unshakable presence. "Sir," the tall officer began, his words halting, "we may have handled this poorly. If there's any way to—" he faltered, searching for words that did not come easily. "We didn't mean—" The commander raised his hand slightly, not as a threat but as a signal to stop. His voice was calm, deliberate. "This is not about what you meant. It is about what you did. Intentions do not erase actions. My son was treated with suspicion for walking to school. He was spoken to in a way no child should ever hear. Do you understand the damage that can do?" The officer looked down, his jaw tight. The others shifted uncomfortably, staring at the ground as if the pavement could swallow them whole. They had been trained to give orders, to enforce rules, to stand tall. Yet now, standing in front of this man and his son, they felt smaller than they ever had. Marcus listened closely, his eyes flicking between the officers and his father. He felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that his father was standing up for him, pride that he had not broken under the pressure, and also a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, these men would learn something from this. Commander Carter continued, his tone steady but powerful. "Respect is not a favor. Respect is not something you give when it is easy or convenient. It is a duty. It is the foundation of the uniform you wear. I know that because I wear one too. I have carried men through fire. I have stood in places where every second mattered, and I have learned that the moment you forget respect, you lose the very thing you swore to protect." His words cut through the silence, reaching not just the officers but Marcus as well. The boy realized that this was what his father had been teaching him all along. Dignity was not something you begged for, it was something you lived by. And when others failed to give it to you, you held on to it yourself until they could no longer deny it. The officers shifted again, their faces pale. The tall one swallowed hard and said quietly, "You're right, sir." His voice was almost a whisper, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who has finally been forced to see the truth. The commander studied him for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "I do not need your apology. My son does not need your apology. What we need is change. The next time you see a child walking to school, see him for who he is. A student, a boy with dreams, someone's son. Do not see him as suspicion. See him as human. That is the respect you owe. Marcus felt his throat tighten. He had not expected his father to speak so directly, so openly. The officers stood in silence, unable to argue, unable to deny the truth staring them in the face. For a brief moment, Marcus thought they might actually listen. The crowd that remained clapped softly again, some nodding, some wiping at their eyes. A man spoke out, "That's the truth right there." Another added, "We all needed to hear that." The officers finally stepped back, their heads lowered. They had nothing left to say. The commander did not wait for more. He turned back toward his son, his voice softening as he spoke only for Marcus to hear. "Come on, son. We have a day to live and you have a test to take." Marcus smiled faintly, a small but genuine smile, the first of the morning. He adjusted his backpack and walked beside his father once more. Every step away from that square felt lighter, as if the weight of the confrontation was slowly being left behind. Yet in Marcus's heart, he knew the moment would never truly leave him. It had become a part of him, a memory that would guide him for the rest of his life. He had learned more in those minutes than any classroom could ever teach. He had learned that dignity could withstand harsh words. He had learned that respect was not something to wait for, but something to demand, not through anger, but through truth. As they reached the edge of the square, Marcus looked up at his father again. "Dad," he said softly, "how did you stay so calm? I wanted to shout back so many times." His father looked down at him, his eyes gentle, because shouting back does not always win. Sometimes the greatest strength is in steady words spoken at the right moment. Sometimes the loudest voice is the one that does not break under pressure. "You showed that today." Marcus thought about it, his small face thoughtful. "So I did okay?" The commander smiled faintly. "You did more than okay. You showed respect for yourself when others didn't. That is the kind of strength that lasts." The boy nodded, his steps more confident now. The harsh words still echoed in his memory, but they no longer hurt the way they had. They had been replaced by something stronger, the lesson his father had turned them into. As they walked away together, the city returned to its rhythm. But for Marcus, the world felt different. He understood now that life would test him in unexpected ways, that people might doubt him without reason, that harsh words might be thrown his way again. But he also knew something even greater, that he had the power to stand tall, and that respect once demanded could never be taken from him again. The father and son walked on, side by side, the morning sun now higher in the sky. The test waiting for Marcus at school seemed small compared to the one he had just faced. And he knew, with certainty, that he had passed. The city had already begun to forget the morning's drama as Marcus and his father walked side by side toward the school. Buses rumbled past. Conversations drifted through the air and shops opened their doors to another ordinary day. Yet for Marcus, nothing about the day felt ordinary anymore. His backpack still pressed heavy against his shoulders, but inside his chest, something new stirred, an awareness, a strength, and a lesson that would stay with him long after the sun set. They walked quietly for a while. The commander's hand remained on his son's shoulder, steady and protective. Marcus glanced up at him, watching the calmness in his stride, the way he seemed untouched by the chaos they had just left. It amazed him. How could someone stand in the middle of so much pressure, so much unfairness, and still speak with such clarity and calm? Marcus wanted to understand that. He wanted to carry that kind of strength himself. "Dad?" Marcus finally said, his voice hesitant but steady. "Were you angry back there?" Commander Carter looked down at his son, his expression thoughtful. "Yes, son. I was angry. But anger is not the same as action. If I had let anger speak for me, I might have shouted, maybe even lost control. And then the lesson would have been lost. Anger makes noise. Respect makes impact." Marcus let the words sink in. He thought about the harsh words that had been thrown at him, words that still felt like they had burned themselves into his memory. He thought about how easy it would have been to shout back, to scream at the unfairness of it all. But his father was right. That would not have changed anything. What had changed everything was the calm strength his father showed, the way he turned a cruel moment into a truth that no one could deny. I wanted to cry. Marcus admitted softly. When he said that to me, I wanted to cry. His father slowed his steps, turning to look at him. Son, there is no shame in wanting to cry. Tears are human. But you didn't cry. And even if you had, it would not have made you weak. What made you strong was the way you chose to stand. You remembered who you are. That is what matters. Marcus nodded, his throat tight. He had always thought strength meant never showing fear, never showing weakness. But now he realized strength was deeper than that. Strength was standing tall even when fear was inside you, even when cruel words tried to push you down. They reached the school gate. Students in uniforms laughed and chatted, some running to beat the bell, others standing in groups with backpacks slung carelessly over their shoulders. To them it was just another morning. None of them knew what Marcus had just gone through. None of them could have guessed that he had already passed a harder test than anything written on paper. Commander Carter stopped outside the gate, crouching slightly so his eyes were level with his son's. His voice lowered, softer now, meant only for Marcus. Today you learned something that will stay with you forever. The world is not always fair. Sometimes people will judge you before they even know you. But the lesson is this: you do not have to let their judgment become your truth. You carry your own truth. You carry your dignity, and no one can take that from you unless you give it away. Marcus listened carefully, every word carving itself into his heart. He felt a swell of pride, not just because his father was proud of him, but because he was proud of himself. He had endured something painful, and instead of breaking, he had discovered strength he never knew he had. The commander rested a firm hand on Marcus's shoulder once more. You are my son. But more than that, you are your own person. You stood tall when it mattered most. That is a lesson some men never learn, even after years of life. You learned it at 12. Carry it with you, always. Marcus swallowed hard, blinking back the sting in his eyes. I will, Dad. The bell rang, pulling students into the building. Marcus straightened his tie and adjusted his backpack. His father gave him a small smile. Go on, you've got a math test waiting, and I expect you to ace it. For the first time that morning, Marcus laughed, a small, genuine laugh that eased the tightness in his chest. I'll try, he said, before stepping toward the school doors. He walked into the building with a confidence he had never felt before. The faces of his classmates, the chatter of the hallways, the scrape of chairs in classrooms, all of it felt lighter, easier. He knew something they did not. He had faced a test outside these walls, one far greater than numbers or equations, and he had passed. As he sat at his desk and opened his notebook, Marcus repeated his father's words silently. Respect is not a gift. Respect is a duty. Dignity is yours. Hold on to it always. The lesson would stay with him, guiding him through the years to come, through every challenge, every doubt, every moment when the world tried to tell him who he was not. He knew now with certainty that no matter what happened, he carried his truth within him. Outside the school, Commander Carter stood for a moment longer, watching his son disappear into the crowd of students. His chest filled with pride. Marcus had faced something hard, something unfair, and he had risen above it. The commander turned and walked away, his stride steady, his heart lighter. He knew his son would face more challenges in the future. Every person did. But he also knew that today Marcus had learned the most important lesson of all. And somewhere inside, Marcus knew it too.